100 years ago, America was mid-roar in the roaring 20s. Jazz was electric, Broadway was exploding, and songwriters were turning out standards that people are still singing today. Here are 10 songs that turned 100 this year, all hits from 1926. Number 10, I Can't Believe That You're in Love With Me by Jimmy McHugh and Clarence Gaskell, 1926.
I can't believe that you're in love with me.
Jimmy McHugh was one of the busiest songwriters in New York in the mid-1920s, already building toward the career that would eventually produce I'm in the Mood for Love, On the Sunny Side of the Street, and dozens of other standards that shaped American pop music for the next 3 decades. In 1926, he was working on Tin Pan Alley and teaming up with different lyricists to generate a constant stream of material. His collaboration with lyricist Clarence Gaskell on I Can't Believe That You're in Love With Me produced a song that caught on immediately and proved to have extraordinary durability. The song was published in 1926 and recorded by more than 20 artists in the 16 years following its publication. The premise is simple. The narrator finds it genuinely hard to believe that someone beautiful and desirable could have chosen to love him. But the way McHugh built the melody gave the lyric a genuineness and vulnerability that more sophisticated constructions often lack. It sounds like something a real person in a real situation would feel.
That I'm on your mind each place you go, they can't believe.
The song became a jazz standard, absorbed into the repertoire of big bands, small combos, and solo vocalists across the following decades. Benny Goodman, Ella Fitzgerald, Frank Sinatra, and Louis Armstrong all recorded versions. It is one of those songs that nobody is entirely sure how many times it has been covered, partly because so many early recordings were made for regional or label-specific release and are difficult to catalog. McHugh himself went on to write for the Cotton Club Revues in Harlem throughout the late 1920s and early 1930s, which put him in close creative collaboration with Duke Ellington and the generation of black musicians who were defining American popular music. I Can't Believe That You're in Love With Me was one of the early demonstrations that he could write melody that lasted.
I can't believe that you're in love with me.
Number 9, Do, Do, Do by George Gershwin and Ira Gershwin, 1926.
Do, what I do at all.
By 1926, George and Ira Gershwin were already operating at a creative altitude that very few partnerships in the history of American music have matched. George had premiered Rhapsody in Blue in February 1924, a piece that redrew the lines between classical music and popular jazz, and had followed it with Concerto in F in 1925. The Broadway musicals he wrote with Ira were hits, and the songs from them were taken up immediately by orchestras and recording artists across the country. OK opened on Broadway on November 8, 1926 at the Imperial Theater and ran for 256 performances. The book was written by Guy Bolton and P.G. Wodehouse. Gertrude Lawrence starred. The show produced 2 songs that became lasting standards, Someone to Watch Over Me and Do, Do, Do.
Baby, let's try again. Sigh.
Do, Do, Do has a quality that is typical of the best Gershwin. It sounds almost easy, as if the tune and the lyric fell into place without effort, which is precisely the impression that represents thousands of hours of the most refined musical thinking of the era. Ira Gershwin's lyric uses the repetition of do, do, do in a way that is simultaneously childlike in its sound and completely adult in its emotional context. It was performed in the original production by Gertrude Lawrence and Oscar Shaw. It charted in 1926 and has been recorded and performed continuously since. Miles Davis included a version on one of his early Columbia recordings. Bobby Short performed it regularly at the Carlyle Hotel in New York City for decades. It is one of those songs that has never quite left circulation because the music itself makes the case for continued existence with every new performance.
Do, what I do at all.
Number 8, Squeeze Me by Fats Waller, 1926.
Pick me up, oh babe, on your knee. Oh.
Fats Waller was 22 years old in 1926, and he had already been working as a professional musician in Harlem for several years. He had recorded for the first time in 1922, was a sought-after session pianist and organist, and had already absorbed the influence of his mentor, James P. Johnson, the father of stride piano, sufficiently to be developing his own voice. Squeeze Me was one of the first pieces he composed that gave a clear preview of what that voice would become. The song was written by Waller with lyrics by Clarence Williams and recorded by Clarence Williams's Blue Five, featuring Louis Armstrong in 1926. It has a loose, relaxed sexuality in its melody that is characteristic of the tradition it comes from. The stride piano and blues that filled the Harlem rent parties and small clubs in the 1920s. Without ever being crude about it, Waller had a gift for finding the comic and the sensual in the same musical phrase, and Squeeze Me demonstrates that gift at an early stage of its development.
Baby, squeeze me and kiss me some more.
Waller went on to become one of the most beloved performers in American popular music through the 1930s and into the 1940s. His recordings for Victor Records, his radio performances, his live shows at the Cotton Club and Carnegie Hall, his theatrical personality on film. He died in December 1943 on a train from Los Angeles to New York at the age of 39. He had composed well over 400 songs, many of them standards, and had given the American musical vocabulary a warmth and playfulness that his successors are still drawing from. Squeeze Me was the beginning of all of that. It is a 1926 song by a 22-year-old who had no idea he was going to die at 39 and a great deal of work to do before then.
Pick me up, oh babe, on your knee. Oh.
Number 7, Are You Lonesome Tonight by Roy Turk and Lou Hanman, 1926.
Are you lonesome tonight? Do you miss me?
Most people, if asked when Are You Lonesome Tonight was written, would say 1960. That was the year Elvis Presley recorded it, a version that spent 6 weeks at number 1 on the Billboard Pop Singles chart and crossed over to the R&B chart and the UK Singles chart simultaneously, making it one of the most commercially successful recordings of his career. But the song was written 34 years earlier. Roy Turk and Lou Hanman were Tin Pan Alley professionals working in New York when they wrote Are You Lonesome Tonight in 1926. The song was published in 1927 and recorded by several artists in that year, including Charles Hart, the first published recording from May 9, 1927, and Vaughn DeLeath, known as the original Radio Girl, who was one of the first performers to deliberately adapt her singing style for broadcast microphones rather than concert halls. There was also Henry Burr, one of the most recorded vocalists of the acoustic era, who understood better than almost anyone how to make a microphone feel like a conversation. None of those versions turned the song into a major hit.
Are you sorry we drifted apart?
The song drifted through the 1930s and 1940s without finding the audience it was looking for. Then, in 1950, the Blue Baron Orchestra took a version into the top 20 on Billboard's Pop Singles chart, the first indication that the song had real commercial life beyond its original moment. A decade later, Elvis Presley found it. He had learned it as a child from his mother, Gladys, who knew the song and sang it around the house. He understood something about it that previous recording artists had sensed but not fully articulated, and he delivered a version in April 1960 that turned a 1926 Tin Pan Alley ballad into one of the defining recordings of the early 1960s. The song contains a spoken word bridge that Turk based on themes from Shakespeare's As You Like It, All the World's a Stage, and on the opera Pagliacci by Ruggiero Leoncavallo. The bridge, delivered in Presley's distinctive baritone with its particular quality of barely suppressed emotion, became one of the most famous passages in American pop music. A song written in 1926, first published in 1927, carries within it a bridge from Shakespeare and Leoncavallo, was carried through decades by a handful of recordings that didn't quite catch, found its audience through Elvis Presley in 1960, and turns 100 years old this year. Very few songs have a journey like that.
Are you lonesome tonight? Do you miss me?
Number 6, Blue Room by Richard Rodgers and Lawrence Hart, 1926. Richard Rodgers and Lawrence Hart began their professional collaboration in 1919 and spent the following 2 decades writing some of the most sophisticated and emotionally complex songs in the American theater. By the time their final Broadway show together, Pal Joey in 1940, they had created a body of work that stands as one of the great artistic partnerships in the history of American music. Blue Room came from their 1926 musical The Girlfriend, which opened at the Broadway Theater on March 17, 1926, and ran for 301 performances. The show featured a book by Herbert Fields and starred Eva Puck, Sammy White, Dorothea James, and John Hundley. Blue Room was the song that audiences took home. Rogers wrote a melody that is clean and self-contained. It doesn't reach or strain, it simply moves from beginning to end with a sense of inevitability that marks the best of his work. Hart's lyric describes a private domestic world, a room, a couple, everything they need, contained within four walls, the outside world irrelevant. The specific details of Hart's writing, the trousseau, the blue room, the new room, give the lyric a texture that more generalized love songs lack. The Rogers and Hart partnership eventually ended, not because of professional disagreement, but because of Hart's deteriorating health, his alcoholism, and his deep personal unhappiness. He died in November 1943 at the age of 48. Rogers subsequently partnered with Oscar Hammerstein II, producing Oklahoma, Carousel, The King and I, South Pacific, and The Sound of Music. The work with Hart is different in character, more ironic, more sophisticated, more melancholy beneath the surfaces, and Blue Room is one of its most purely happy moments. Number 5. Deed I Do by Fred Rose and Walter Hirsch, 1926.
I'm glad that I'm the one who fought.
Deed I Do has a specific place in music history beyond its own commercial success. It contains the first recorded performance of Benny Goodman, who was 17 years old when he played clarinet on Ben Pollock and his Californian's December 1926 recording of the song. Fred Rose wrote the music, and Walter Hirsch supplied the lyrics for a piece that was introduced by vaudeville performer S.L. Stambaugh and popularized immediately by Ben Burney's recording. The song has a directness and swing that made it amenable to almost any performance style. It has been recorded as Tin Pan Alley Pop, as jazz, as swing, as big band, and as intimate club vocal, and it works in all of those contexts because the bones of the composition are solid.
Oh my, do I, honey.
Benny Goodman's appearance on the December 1926 recording is brief. He was one player among several, not a featured soloist, but it marks the entry into recorded music of one of the figures who would define American popular music for the following 3 decades. Goodman went on to record hundreds of sessions as a leader, to perform the January 1938 Carnegie Hall Jazz Concert that is one of the most celebrated live recordings in history, to define what the clarinet could be in a jazz context, and to be known as the King of Swing. In December 1926, he was 17 years old, playing a 1926 song called Deed I Do, and nobody knew any of that yet. The song was recorded by Billie Holiday, Anita O'Day, and dozens of other vocalists across the following decades. Rose himself became a significant figure in country music in the 1940s as a co-founder of Acuff Rose Music, the Nashville publishing house that helped establish the modern country music industry.
I'm glad that I'm the one who fought.
Number 4, Black Bottom Stomp by Jelly Roll Morton, 1926. Jelly Roll Morton made a series of recordings for Victor Records in Chicago in September and December 1926 with his Red Hot Peppers, a small ensemble assembled specifically for recording, that are considered among the most significant jazz recordings in history. Black Bottom Stomp, recorded on September 15, 1926, is one of the best of them. Morton was born Ferdinand Joseph Lamoth in New Orleans in 1890. And he grew up in the environment that produced jazz. The Creole musical culture of the city's downtown neighborhoods, the ragtime tradition, the blues, the brass band music of the streets, the piano styles of the bordellos in Storyville. By 1926, he was 35 years old, had been a professional musician for most of his adult life, and was in the middle of what would prove to be the peak of his recording career. Black Bottom Stomp takes its title from a dance craze that was sweeping the country in 1926, the Black Bottom, which had appeared in the George White's Scandals Broadway review of the same year. But what Morton did with the title is entirely his own. The recording is a small group jazz performance of extraordinary complexity and precision. Morton had the ability to conceptualize arrangements for small ensembles in a way that preserved the improvisational energy of jazz while giving it an architectural structure that most jazz of the era didn't have. The pianist and musicologist Alan Lomax, who later recorded Morton's famous Library of Congress sessions in 1938, argued that Morton was not simply a jazz musician, but a jazz composer in the full sense of the word. And Black Bottom Stomp is one of the pieces that supports that argument most clearly. Morton's later years were difficult. The swing era displaced the New Orleans jazz style he had helped create, and by the late 1930s, he was largely forgotten commercially. The 1938 Library of Congress recordings revived interest in his work, but he died in Los Angeles in July 1941 without regaining his former commercial position. The recordings from September 1926 outlasted him by decades and are still studied and debated by jazz musicians and historians today. Number 3, The Birth of the Blues by Ray Henderson, Buddy DeSilva, and Lou Brown, 1926.
They heard the breeze in the tree.
Ray Henderson appears on this list twice, first for Bye Bye Blackbird and again here, which reflects the remarkable productivity of a songwriter who was turning out hit after hit in 1926. The Birth of the Blues was written by Henderson with lyrics by the partnership of Buddy DeSilva and Lou Brown, and appeared in the George White's Scandals of 1926, the same Broadway revue that introduced the Black Bottom Dance. The song tells a semi-mythological origin story for the blues as a music, the sounds of the American South, breezes, trees, birds, the Mississippi, merging into something new, something that could only have come from that specific soil and that specific human history. It is, by any standard, a simplification. The blues as a musical form has a complex history that the song doesn't attempt to address, but as a piece of songwriting, it achieves something genuine, a sense of the blues as a living thing, born from an environment rather than manufactured, arising from the ground rather than being imported.
The start of the blues.
The Revelers, a close harmony vocal group that was one of the most commercially successful recording acts of the mid-1920s, had the hit version in 1926. Al Jolson recorded a celebrated version in 1927, bringing his theatrical baritone to a song that was already theatrical by nature. Bing Crosby recorded it in 1937 as part of a Decca session that became one of his most commercially successful recordings of that decade. Crosby had a particular affinity for material that seemed to carry some historical weight, and The Birth of the Blues gave him exactly that. Frank Sinatra performed it as part of his live repertoire for decades, as did Tony Bennett. The song has been in jazz, pop, and cabaret repertoires continuously since its first performance on the Broadway stage in 1926, a song about where the blues came from that has itself never quite stopped being sung. Henderson, DeSilva, and Brown continued collaborating through the late 1920s, producing several more Broadway shows and a string of hit songs before the partnership dissolved, as each member's career moved in different directions.
They heard the breeze in the tree.
Number 2, Someone to Watch Over Me by George Gershwin and Ira Gershwin, 1926.
Only girl I ever think of when.
George Gershwin wrote Someone to Watch Over Me in the spring of 1926 for the musical OK, which was preparing to open on Broadway that fall. He had composed it originally as an up-tempo, jazzy number, marked scherzando, playful, in the sheet music. Then, during rehearsals, he slowed it down. He is described finding an old rag doll in a prop box and playing the melody while holding it, and discovering that at the slower tempo, the song became something entirely different. A longing, vulnerable piece that communicated something no faster version could have. The OK musical itself was produced by Alex A. Ahrens and Vinton Fredley, with a book by Guy Bolton and P.G. Wodehouse, one of the more remarkable writing partnerships in Broadway history, given that Wodehouse was primarily known as a humorist novelist. The show starred Gertrude Lawrence, an English actress whose enormous talent and stage presence had already made her one of the most celebrated performers in West End London. This was her American Broadway debut, and Someone to Watch Over Me made her famous in the United States almost overnight. Lawrence performed it in the original Broadway production while holding a rag doll, a stage picture that audiences found unexpectedly moving. She stood alone on the stage, singing to the doll and threw it to the person who wasn't there. And by the end of the number, the house was consistently silent in the specific way that means something genuine has been communicated. Lawrence's recording rose to number 2 on the charts in 1927, and the show itself ran for 256 performances.
Tell me, where is the shepherd?
The song became one of the defining pieces of the Great American Songbook, a standard in every meaningful sense, a song that every jazz musician plays, that every vocalist eventually records, that appears in films and television and concert halls and living rooms, with a frequency that, after nearly a century, has not significantly diminished. Frank Sinatra recorded 3 different versions across his career. Linda Ronstadt's 1983 version from What's New brought it to a generation that had been born after the original Sinatra recordings. Sting performed it at the closing ceremony of the 1984 Los Angeles Olympics. Tony Bennett recorded it with Lady Gaga in 2014. The list of people who have felt compelled to record this song is essentially a list of the 20th century's most significant vocalists, and a few from the 21st century as well. What Gershwin found when he slowed that tempo down in 1926, holding a rag doll in a rehearsal room, was something about human longing that has not changed in the 100 years since.
Only girl I ever think of when.
Number 1. Bye Bye Blackbird by Ray Henderson and Mort Dixon, 1926. The first recording of Bye Bye Blackbird was made by Sam Lannon's Dance Orchestra in March 1926, and within the year there were at least 4 hit versions by Gene Austin, Nick Lucas, Benny Kruger, and Leo Reisman. By the end of 1926, it was established as one of the year's most significant songs. By the end of the century, it had accumulated a legacy that placed it among the most recorded and performed pieces in the American popular music tradition. Ray Henderson wrote the melody, and Mort Dixon wrote the words. Henderson was 26 years old in 1926, the same year he wrote The Birth of the Blues for Broadway, and was operating with a fluency and productivity that would characterize the rest of the decade. Dixon was 34, a New York lyricist who had been working in the business since the early 1920s and who understood how to match a lyric to a melody in a way that made both seem inevitable. The song's lyric is about leaving somewhere that isn't working and returning to someone who is waiting. The blackbird of the title appears to be a symbol of unhappiness or dissatisfaction, the thing being left behind, while the destination is warmth, acceptance, a place where somebody waits for me. Dixon later described the image as primarily ornithological and without hidden meaning, but commentators over the decades have found various readings in it, including interpretations connecting the blackbird to a specific cultural code in the African American community of the 1920s. During World War II, the German propaganda apparatus produced a version of Bye Bye Blackbird with altered lyrics designed to demoralize Allied troops. The alteration required careful attention because the Nazis had banned jazz from German radio. The song had to be made less obviously jazz while retaining enough of the original for Allied listeners to recognize it. The fact that Nazi propagandists chose a 1926 American pop song as a tool says something about the reach the song had achieved in fewer than 20 years. Gene Austin's original 1926 recording was inducted into the Grammy Hall of Fame in 2005. The song has been recorded by Miles Davis, Joe Cocker, Lena Horne, Rod Stewart, Paul McCartney, Sam Cooke, and hundreds of other artists across the decades. John Coltrane's 1962 album of the same name, recorded live in Frankfurt, Germany on August 22, 1962, during a European tour, is considered one of the most significant jazz recordings of the 1960s, a case of a standard being so thoroughly reinvented that the original seems temporarily to recede entirely. Mort Dixon died in Bronxville, New York in March 1956 at the age of 64. He was elected to the Songwriters Hall of Fame. Ray Henderson died in Greenwich, Connecticut in December 1970 at the age of 71. The song they wrote together in 1926 is 100 years old this year, and it will be played somewhere today, on a piano, at a wedding, in a jazz club, at a memorial service, in a living room, by someone who may not know anything about either of them, but knows exactly what the song is asking for and where it wants to take you. That is probably the best definition of a standard, a song that knows how to find the people who need it, even when everyone who made it is gone. If any of these songs took you somewhere unexpected, hit the like button and subscribe. There are more stories like these waiting for you.